everyone. All right, so this is our video discussing Plato's Euthyphro. And let me just pull this up, sorry. So in our introduction last week, we said a little bit about the context of the Euthyphro, the history behind it, right? The execution of Socrates. Let me close this window a little bit. The execution of Socrates, and we discussed a little bit about the nature of Platonic dialogues, right? Every dialogue, or almost every dialogue, takes on a particular topic or subject that is going to be discussed by the interlocutors in the dialogue. And in the Euthyphro, that topic is piety, or as we have in our translation, the holy. And so we also remember that Plato is an idealist, philosophical idealist, interested in forms or in ideas. And so the topic of the Euthyphro is the form of piety, or the form of the holy. And the last thing we want to recall from last time is the fact that Plato is writing dialogues, not treatises, and that we should always be thinking when we're reading Plato about what the form of the text is telling us, right? What do we get out of the dialogue, the sort of dramatic action of it, not just the philosophical content on its own necessarily. So let's get into the text then. We begin at the porch of the king Archon, right? And so this is the sort of courthouse in ancient Athens. The king Archon is the chief magistrate in Athenian government. The Archon is the sort of leader. And so Socrates is arriving at the porch of the king Archon, arriving at court, and he's met by Euthyphro, right? Euthyphro, who is a young prophet of some kind, a young soothsayer. He predicts the future and claims to have expertise in religious matters, right? Expertise in what the gods want, expertise in piety and things holy. And when Euthyphro meets Socrates, he opens by asking, and Socrates, what are you doing at court? Right? You can't have come here to prosecute someone, surely. You aren't here to indict someone. Socrates says no. Right? So there's a couple things to note in this opening, right? The sort of dramatic content of the dialogue here. So Euthyphro begins, right? What has happened, Socrates, to make you leave your accustomed pastimes in the Lyceum and spend your time here today at the king's porch? Right? You can hardly have a suit pending before the king, as I do. So first of all, Euthyphro is noting that this is an unusual place for Socrates to be, right? The philosopher does not come to court. It's rare for the philosopher, for Socrates, to be engaged in this kind of thing, right? So this is marking this unusual setting for philosophy. Right? It is the moment where philosophy enters into the practical realm, right? Where Socrates is forced to deal with practical concerns, this rather abstract philosopher. But then we should also keep in mind and ask ourselves, why is it that Socrates would not indict someone, right? Why does Euthyphro say, it can't be, it can hardly be that you have a suit pending, right? It would be out of character for Socrates to sue someone or take legal action against someone. And Socrates says, no, right, I'm not suing anyone. They don't call it a suit, they call it an indictment, right? Socrates says, I am being indicted. And we then get the story of who is indicting Socrates for what, right? Socrates tells Euthyphro what's happening. And we went over this a little bit, right? And again, right, Socrates is accused of corrupting the youth and inventing new gods. So he says, there's no small thing for him, young as he is, to be knowledgeable in so great a matter. For he says he knows how the youth are being corrupted and who is corrupting them. Right? So Socrates is discussing the person who is charging him, this young man, Meletus. Right? And it's important that Meletus is young and relatively unknown. Right? This question of youth and ambition are important. Socrates, we get a little bit of this Socratic irony, right? Remember this idea that Socrates presents himself as knowing nothing, as absolutely ignorant, and then seeks to be taught by those who believe that they are wise. So Socrates says, no doubt he, Meletus, is wise, and realizing that in my ignorance, I corrupt his comrades. And so with both Meletus and Euthyphro, Socrates makes a big deal of saying, I'm ignorant, you're wise, you teach me. Right? And the fact that both Euthyphro and Meletus are conspicuously young here is, I think, Plato pointing us to something beyond maybe explicitly what Socrates is saying, right? That it is, in particular, a trait of youth to believe in their own wisdom. Right? The older you get, the more you know, the less you believe you know anything. So it's important that the two people that Socrates is trying to learn from are these young men, both very ambitious, interested in making a name for themselves, and in their youth claim to have all this wisdom. So Meletus is charging Socrates because he thinks, because Socrates says, it must be because Meletus is so wise, right? That he knows what corruption is, that he knows who is corrupting the youth. And Socrates says, in my ignorance, perhaps Meletus is right. I have corrupted the youth. So on page 2, we get the actual charge. Right? He says, I am a maker of gods. Because I make new ones and do not worship the old ones, he indicted me on their accounts, he says. Euthyphro says, I see, Socrates, it is because you say the divine sign comes to you from time to time. So Euthyphro is giving us some insight into what this charge might be about. Right? What are these new gods that Socrates is inventing? Right? And he says, you say the divine sign comes to you from time to time. Socrates, on occasion, talks about a daemon, Daemon, a daemon that visits him and guides him. And this daemon is a kind of divine spirit, demigod or divine presence that is Socrates' guide. Now, what we are to make of this daemon, what we're going to make of the idea that Socrates thinks he is divinely guided or experiences this kind of divine guidance, is, I think, open to interpretation. I think we could understand this as sort of being along the same lines as conscience, right? What is the experience of conscience It is a kind of the experience of some sort of external force interrupting your consciousness, interrupting your life. Right? Conscience is this experience of some kind of external force guiding you. Right? Your conscience corrects you, shows you what you should do, even when what you should do goes against what you want to do. Now, the daemon, I think, is not just conscience, it's more than that. It's conscience personified, externalized, understood as this external divine force. But in any case, right, it is this daemon of Socrates's that has led him to question the religious traditions of the Athenians of ancient Greece, and the daemon who sort of guides Socrates in all of his critiques of these powerful people in Athens. So the daemon is a kind of new god in the sense that it is the daemon who directs Socrates to challenge religious traditions. Now, I think the mention of the daemon is also important in the context of the Euthyphro, where, right, of course, the charge is sort of irreligiosity, and the reader might be tempted to think that Socrates is irreligious or doesn't believe in religion, thinks religion is sort of inherently bad, or, in common or modern language, we might be tempted to think Socrates is an atheist. And that is not Socrates' position. We'll see by the end of the text sort of what Socrates might understand religion and piety to be. But its early mention of the daemon is, I think, intended to remind readers that Socrates did have a conception of God, was interested in thinking about the meaning of religiosity, the meaning of the gods, and was a kind of reformer rather than a revolutionary or someone that wanted to escape religion. And this is what Euthyphro says, right? That he is charged with inventing religious innovations, right? A challenge to the religious order. He says, Euthyphro says, whenever you are discussing religion, whenever you are discussing what the gods think, right, you have to be very careful. Euthyphro, as a soothsayer, as a kind of fortune teller and expert in religiosity, is familiar with the difficulty of explaining God's will or the will of the gods to the people, right? It will be misrepresented to the people. He says, I'm laughed at when I make my predictions, even though they all come true. Now, this is another important moment of sort of contextual setup on page 2, where Euthyphro says, yes, I know the dangers of discussing God, and he says, or discussing the gods. And he says, the danger of discussing the will of the gods is that you're going to be laughed at. Socrates says, no. What worries me is not that I'll be laughed at, right? I'm not afraid to be laughed at. I'm not afraid that the people will think I'm wrong. And so what is at stake is a difference in values between Euthyphro and Socrates here. Right? Euthyphro, in his youth and ambition, believes that what is to be desired and sought is the admiration and respect of the people. For Socrates, right, the admiration and respect of the people is basically worthless, and the only thing that he desires, that he seeks, is the truth, right? And this sets up a distinction that is is everywhere in Plato, between the opinion of the many, of the people, of the masses, the opinion of the many, and the opinion of the one who knows, right? Of the select few who are actually wise. So Socrates cares about the opinion of the wise, not the many. Right? So being laughed at is not Socrates' fear, as it is for Euthyphro. So already Plato is setting up this juxtaposition between Euthyphro and Socrates. And we see that what concerns Euthyphro is not the truth necessarily, as it is for Socrates, but is approval and acceptance. Now, in this disregard for the opinion of the many, we get more information about Socrates also, about this sort of paragon of philosophers. Unconcerned about the opinion of the many, Socrates believes that the masses are generally wrong, easily misled, and generally confused, right? People in general are not good judges of the truth. People in general are not good judges. People as a whole are confused, not interested in the truth, and should not be listened to, right? And this in itself is somewhat anti-democratic, right? And we remember that the context of the Euthyphro has to do largely with the fall of Athens in the Peloponnesian War, the takeover of Athens by the 30 tyrants, and the collapse of Athenian democracy, which is replaced then by oligarchy during the rule of the 30. And that Socrates is in part being rounded up and charged with these crimes in an attempt on the part of the Athenians to weed out all of those dissident factions that they are blaming for the collapse of democracy. Right? So we get a sort of reminder in this comment of Socrates here that the masses are wrong and one shouldn't worry about their opinion, that Socrates has his questions about democracy, right? And the virtue of democracy. If the majority of the people are wrong and confused, then democracy is problematic, right? A system that is guided by the opinion of the majority is going to be led by the many, by the masses who are, according to Socrates, so often wrong. And so for a Greek reader, there's already a lot of context that's been developed in this very short period. Now, but it's interesting the way that Socrates understands why he is being charged also. Just one final sort of introductory comment here. He says on page 2 that part of what he thinks is threatening about him is his generosity, right? Why is Athens threatened by Socrates, but not by Euthyphro? Socrates says, perhaps they think you give yourself sparingly, that you are unwilling to teach your wisdom. Right? So the reason why they are not afraid of you, perhaps, Socrates says, is that you don't teach your wisdom. You are sparing in teaching. But I fear my own generosity is such that they think I am willing to pour myself out in speech to any man, not only without pay, but glad to pay myself if only someone will listen. So as I just said, if they laugh at me as you say they do, at you, it would not be unpleasant to pass the time in court laughing and joking. But if they are in earnest, how will it then turn out is unclear, right? Except to you prophets. So the reason why Socrates is, or the reason that Socrates gives in this opening for why he is being prosecuted, but someone else who interprets the will of the gods and, in interpreting the will of the gods might be accused of religious innovation or corrupting the youth. Right? What Euthyphro does is on its face very similar to what Socrates is accused of doing. Right? But the reason why Socrates is being charged with something, or the reason he gives here, is that he is teaching the people, right? Pouring himself out in speech to any man. And he's doing it, and this is very important, without pay. He's not doing it for a fee. And this was actually one of the marks in ancient Greece of a true philosopher. What distinguished for Plato a true philosopher from a sophist, someone who teaches kind of false knowledge, false wisdom, is that sophists get paid and philosophers do not. The same would be true of Euthyphro. Euthyphro would be paid to make his prophecies to predict the future, and Socrates is willing to share his wisdom, to teach people for free. I'm not sure what to say in the context of this dialogue about that, except that I think it's interesting that the person who teaches for free is a bigger threat to the establishment than the person who teaches for a fee. Right? I think we'll leave it at that. We will pick that up in our discussion. Now, having had this introduction, having gotten sort of context about what Socrates is doing here, Socrates then turns the discussion to Euthyphro and asks Euthyphro what he is doing at the porch of the king Archon. Right? And we learn that unlike Socrates, Euthyphro is bringing a suit. Right? Euthyphro is charging someone with a crime. Now, this is where Plato begins what I think we should understand as a kind of thought experiment, right? Maybe the first ethical thought experiment, right? Socrates asks, okay, you're here, you're bringing a suit. Who are you charging? And Euthyphro says, I am bringing charges against my father. And this is shocking, even to Socrates, right? He says, it must be some very grave crime that your father has committed. It must have been a crime against some other family member. It must have been a crime against someone who you love almost as dearly as you love your father. The implication being, right, it is strange and even impious or irreligious, perhaps even unethical, to bring a legal charge against a family member. And this is partly playing to ancient Greek mores and traditions, and a tension in ancient Greek politics between the family and the city, the family and the state. There was always sort of a question of where one's loyalties ought to lie, right? Do my loyalties lie with my family or with the state? If my family breaks the law, am I loyal to them and do I not turn them in? Or am I loyal to the state and do I turn them in? This is one of the central tensions and contradictions, tragic sort of conflicts in Sophocles' play Antigone. So Socrates is playing on this tension, right? You have decided to be loyal to the state rather than to your father. This crime must have been very grave. Maybe it was committed against another one of your family members. And I think we should ask ourselves why Socrates seems to here believe that one should perhaps not prosecute a member of one's family if they commit a crime. And we'll ask this question in our discussion. Right? If a family member of yours commits a crime, do you turn them in? Right? If your brother murders someone, do you turn your brother into the police? If your brother asks you to help bury the body, do you help bury the body? Right? To what extent does your loyalty to a state limit your loyalty to family, and vice versa? Right? And what are the sort of ethical dimensions of that? Right? Is it ethical to help your brother if they've murdered someone? Is it ethical to turn them in? Right? Where does my ethical obligation lie when I have these dual loyalties, these conflicting responsibilities to family and to state? So this is also what is, right, obviously being evoked here. Euthyphro says, in kind of civic spirit that we might find commendable, it is laughable, Socrates. You're thinking it makes a difference whether or not the man was a relative and not this and this alone, whether his slayer was justified. So, sorry, I forgot to mention what the crime is. Euthyphro's father has indeed committed a serious crime, which is murder. Euthyphro's father has murdered someone. And Socrates says, well, you must have killed another family member in order for you to be prosecuting him. So Euthyphro says, it's laughable that you think it makes a difference whether who the man was who was killed, right? Whether his slayer was justified. The only thing we need to ask ourselves is, was the killing justified? Right? Doesn't matter who my father killed, doesn't matter who the victim was, it only matters whether or not the action was justified in itself. So if the killing is justified, let him off. If not, prosecute him, right? Even if he shares your hearth and table. So what Euthyphro is articulating here is the rule of law, essentially, right? That no matter who the victim is, no matter who the perpetrator is, the law has to be abided. So it's sort of strange that Socrates is pushing back against this, right? Now, the story gets more complicated, though. And this thought experiment gets built up even more. There's already some ethical ambiguity as to whether or not Euthyphro is doing the right thing, if he's actually doing something just. But it gets more complicated because then we get the story of how Euthyphro's father actually killed someone. And in this story, there are additional sort of cultural layers and assumptions that may be foreign to us. Right? We are better able to understand this loyalty to family and state, these conflicting loyalties, than we are able to understand the sort of hierarchy of obligations that you had to different members of society, right? Different castes of society. So the story goes as follows. Euthyphro's father comes home to find one of his servants, to find that one of his servants has gotten extremely drunk and in this drunkenness has killed one of Euthyphro's father's slaves. So one of Euthyphro's father's servants got drunk and killed one of Euthyphro's father's slaves. So I would say that slavery in ancient Athens was different than slavery in the United States. It was not racially based. It was not hereditary, meaning that it wasn't the case that a slave's children would be slaves, and it wasn't the case that slaves were enslaved for their whole lives. Generally, a slave was taken on for a period of time and then released, often released with reparations and sent on their way. Right? So generally, slaves were taken after the loss of a war, or when a city is conquered in war, or along those lines. So slavery was a very different thing. Certainly, it's still a horrible practice, but not quite the same thing that we think of when we think of American slavery. But in any case, right? So the slave, Euthyphro's father's slave, is the very bottom rung of society. Right? And so Plato might be asking the reader, whether or not this bottom caste of society deserves justice to the same extent that the upper castes deserve justice. And so far, we don't know what Plato's position is, or even what Socrates' position is. We are just being given this sort of set of things to take into account when we are judging the justice of an action. So, thus far, we have this question of charging a family member. Now we have the question of whether or not it matters if the victim is, at the bottom caste of society. We also have seen another qualifier, which is that the servant that kills the slave does so when he's very drunk, right? So unintentionally, or in what we might today call a crime of passion, right? Does it matter the state of mind, the intention of the person who committed this crime? Does drunkenness change the way we calculate responsibility and justice here? And then we get this sort of final ethical ambiguity here, which is the way that Euthyphro's father then commits this quote-unquote murder. So Euthyphro's father, discovering that this servant has murdered a slave, ties the servant up and leaves him in a ditch. Now, why does he do this? Right? He ties him up and leaves him in a ditch. He does this so that he, Euthyphro's father, can go seek advice from the religious leaders in Athens. Right? Euthyphro's father doesn't know what the correct thing to do is and goes to seek guidance. Euthyphro himself, however, much younger than Euthyphro's father, doesn't believe he needs guidance in knowing what's right. Right? He knows what the just thing to do is, even though his father doesn't. So again, there's a sort of commentary on the nature of youth, the wisdom of youth, and the wisdom of the old. So Euthyphro's father ties this servant up, leaves him in a ditch to go seek advice. And while he's gone, the servant dies, right? Dies of exposure, dies of thirst. Now, we'd ask again, is this murder, right? If you tie a murderer up and leave them while you deliberate about what you ought to do with them, is that properly speaking, murder, right? Certainly we'd say maybe that sounds like manslaughter, right? It sounds like an accidental killing. We can infer that Euthyphro's father didn't mean to kill him. He didn't know what to do with him, right? He was trying to figure out what to do with him. So we can infer that the death was accidental. The person that was accidentally killed by Euthyphro's father was himself a murderer, right? And a murderer of a slave. And so we just need to sort of think about all of these particularities in the situation. How do I evaluate the justice of this action? How does each one of these particulars change the way I'll think about the scenario? And Euthyphro says, doesn't matter. None of those things matter, right? I know what to do, and I'm going to do it, right? The law applies equally to all cases. None of these considerations really matter. So Plato, I think, is very clearly setting up a very complex situation with a lot of ins and outs, reasons for doubt, reasons for uncertainty, and then presents us with Euthyphro, who doesn't seem to take any of those into consideration. Right? He knows what to do. He's going to charge his father with murder. So Socrates says on page 4, but in the name of Zeus, Euthyphro, do you think you yourself know so accurately how matters stand respecting divine law and things holy and unholy, that with the facts as you declare, you can prosecute your own father without fear that it is you, on the contrary, who are doing an unholy thing? And so look at the facts you just laid out, the facts as you declare. How can you be so sure that you are doing the right thing? How can you be so sure that it's not you who's in the wrong here for charging your father? Right? So again, what you are doing is pretty extreme, and the case seems very complex. How do you know that you're not wrong? So I think we can ask, right? Do we think Euthyphro is doing the right thing? Do we think that Euthyphro's father did the right thing? Right? Plato's giving us lots of these sort of ethical dilemmas, ethical scenarios for us to consider. So he asks then, Euthyphro says, of course I know the divine will, right? Of course I know God's will. Of course I know that I'm doing the right thing. Of course I know what's right. Socrates says, in classic Socrates fashion, all right, this is great. I finally met someone that knows certainly what the right thing to do is, that knows what the gods want. So Socrates says, again, this is page 4, I must become your pupil. I have to learn from you. Won't you teach me what you know? Socrates says, there's one thing in particular that I want to know from you. So he asks, what sort of thing do you say the pious and impious are, with respect to murder and other things as well? Or is it not the holy just by itself? Or is not the holy just by itself the same in every action? Right? So, what sort of thing do you say the pious and impious are? And, right, he asks, or is not the holy, so with respect to murder and other things, is the pious, the holy, different in different cases, or is it always the same? Right? And he asks, or is not the holy just by itself the same in every action? Right? So we get already here the first sort of move toward what Plato is having Socrates drive at, or what Socrates wants to learn, wants to discover, which is the form of the holy just by itself, that which makes every holy action holy, that which makes every pious action pious. Right? What is the form of the holy, such that every holy thing is defined as holy? What's the definition of the holy in itself? Is the holy always the same in every case? So Euthyphro tries to make this kind of universal answer. The first answer that Euthyphro gives is an attempt to, I think, respond to what Socrates really wants. Right? And so he says, that the holy is always the same. And he accuses those who mock him, those who disbelieve him, of hypocrisy. He accuses those who say that what he's doing now in charging his father with hypocrisy. He says, they say one thing about the gods and another about me. Right? They say that what I'm doing is impious when I do it. Right? Charging your father is impious when I do it, but charging and prosecuting your father is pious when the gods do it. And so what Euthyphro is getting at is what is good for the gods is good for us. If the gods do it, then that's what we should do. We should do what the gods do. The holy is whatever the gods do, and we do as the gods do, then we do the holy also. And so what Euthyphro is saying is, in this case of prosecuting my father, I know that it is pious, I know that it is a holy action because I have a divine precedent, because what I'm doing now, another God has done. So to justify the piety of this action, Euthyphro is making an appeal to what Zeus did to his father, Kronos. And so if we remember a little bit of Greek mythology, right, Kronos is the king of the Titans, of the old gods in ancient Greece. And Kronos is the god who eats all of his children. Right? Kronos means time, and time eats all of its children. But so Kronos was the king of the old gods. Kronos ate all of his children because there was a prophecy that one of his children would eventually kill him. Right? So when Zeus is born, the son of Kronos, Zeus is spirited away by his mother, escaped from Kronos, and does indeed grow up to kill Kronos, right? And establish a new order to become the new king of the gods. So Kronos is killed by Zeus, right? Zeus kills his father for his father's crimes. So Euthyphro is saying, right, Zeus did it, therefore it has to be holy, it has to be pious, therefore I should do it, and what I'm doing is correct. Now, this gives us our first sort of universal definition, or definition of the holy, right? Which is that the holy, what is holy is doing what is dear to the gods, doing what the gods love, right? In this case, prosecuting criminal fathers is dear to the gods, right? Because a god did it. So the holy is what is dear to the gods. And on page 5, Socrates brings up a problem with this theory. Right? Socrates now got an answer from Euthyphro about the definition of the whole, begins to sort of critique this definition, to pick this definition apart. The whole is what is dear to the gods. Socrates asks, do you believe there is really war among the gods, and terrible enmities and battles, and other sorts of things our poets tell? Right? Do the gods ever disagree? Right? And Euthyphro says, yes, right? Of course the gods disagree. So let's keep this in mind, right? Plato sort of plants this seed, and it's going to come back to it. So, doing what is holy is doing what's dear to the gods, and now we are reminded that gods often disagree, or at war with each other. But Socrates puts this down for a minute, picks up another line of approach. Right? He says, last time you defined the holy by saying what you are doing now is holy. You give an example of the holy and define the universal through the particular. Socrates' new line of approach is to say, well, okay, you may have justified this particular example, right? That what you're doing now is holy. This argument, right, the holy is what is dear to the gods, works in this case. But you haven't shown that this definition of the holy works in every case. In other words, don't give me an example of the holy and explain why that example is holy. Give me a definition of the holy in itself so that I can always recognize every example of the holy, right? You've shown me that this is an example of the holy, but what I'm looking for is a definition that will teach me to know the difference between the holy and the unholy in every case. Right? Do you recall that I did not ask you to teach me about some one or two of the many things which are holy, but about the characteristic itself by which all holy things are holy, he says on page 6. And so he wants, again, the form. And he gives a little hint about why he wants this form, which is more or less what I just said, right? Says he wants this definition of the form so that I may look to it and use it as a standard by which, should those things which you or someone else may do be of that sort, right? So I may look at it and use it as a standard. I need this universal definition so I can determine whether any particular example is holy or not. So the form is a kind of standard. Form is a kind of norm, I guess you could say. It is a measure that we can then use to judge the things of the world, the particular examples, right? We use an idea in order to evaluate particular things. So this is where Euthyphro says, in general, the form of the holy is to do what God loves, and you will be holy. Holy is doing what the gods love. So Euthyphro doubled down on this definition, and Socrates is now going to return to that first objection, right, that there is a war between the gods. The gods disagree. How can it be that gods disagree? About what do they disagree? And now Socrates gives us a kind of theory of disagreement. What kinds of things we can sort of justifiably disagree about. he says, what in general do we disagree about? We disagree about what is true, right? Or things that we don't know with certainty. There are some things, Socrates says, that we don't really disagree about, or rather, there are certain disagreements that can very easily be clarified. And because they can be clarified, we don't disagree about them for very long. We don't disagree, for example, about number, things concerning number. We don't disagree about mathematics for very long. If we were to disagree about whether 5 plus 3 is bigger than 4 plus 2, right? We might have an initial moment of disagreement where someone would say, no, I think 4 plus 2 is bigger than 5 plus 3. But we wouldn't disagree for very long because we could very easily demonstrate which one of us is right. We would just get a bunch of rocks and demonstrate that 8 is more than 6, right? That the sum of 5 plus 3 is greater than the sum of 4 plus 2. So when it comes to things to mathematical or scientific knowledge, we don't disagree. We can demonstrate what is true. The truth can be demonstrated. Mathematical proofs, scientific proofs can be demonstrated. And so there isn't really room for true disagreement in those cases. And there isn't disagreement about empirical truth, about what is. Disagree about what disagreement really consists in is questions about, as Socrates says, the just, the beautiful, and the good. We disagree not about what is, we disagree about our values, right? About what is valuable, about what counts as just or beautiful or good. These kinds of things make us enemies. They also make us friends, right? They are the values that create social bonds. But what is good, what is beautiful, what is just, cannot be demonstrated the way that something mathematical or scientific can be demonstrated. I can never prove that my idea of the just is better than yours. And I can't prove it in the way I can prove a mathematical proof. I can only persuade you. I can only attempt to convince you, to show you my reasoning or my thinking. I can't literally show you the way I can literally show you with a geometrical proof. And Socrates says, so if the gods argue, it must also be about the nature of the good, the beautiful, and the just. And the gods certainly wouldn't argue about mathematics if we don't. So if there is a war, and Euthyphro has already conceded that he believes there is a war among the gods, if there is a war, it must be about these values, what counts as just, what counts as good. And what they value, right, what they believe is just or good, is the same as what they love, what is dear to them. Right? So one God holds dear one idea of justice, and another God holds dear a different idea of justice. So what Socrates is doing is saying, if the gods are at war with one another, then there must be competing views of the good and of justice and the beautiful. In other words, there must be different things and conflicting things that the gods hold dear. So, to begin with, this means that Euthyphro's definition of the holy is inconsistent or contradictory, right? Because different gods hold different things dear. But there's also we'll come back to that in a second, but there's also a larger point here, which is this is also a moment of Socrates beginning to present that larger critique of Greek theology that he is being charged with, right? This innovation in religion, this corrupting of the youth. What Socrates is doing here is beginning to sow the seeds of doubt about the possibility that the gods should be at war with each other, right? In Homer, in Hesiod, in all the Greek religious texts, there are stories about the gods being enemies with one another, right? Gods fighting each other, gods holding different things as valuable. And by pointing out that this war between the gods leads to inconsistencies and contradictions in the idea of piety or the holy, Socrates is calling into question Greek theology and Greek religion. And we recall, right, that this is what he's being charged with. So here he is talking to a young man, questioning Greek religion. Right? Here he is committing the crime that he is charged with, corrupting the youth and inventing new gods, questioning the old gods. So in this very moment where Socrates is attempting to clarify, to understand what piety really is, what the holy really is, and therefore to sort of question and clarify what the gods really are, he is guilty of the crime that he's being charged with. So another kind of irony, and I think we can read this in part as Plato saying Socrates did nothing wrong, right? That the law was wrong, that this sort of questioning is good, the truth should be held above our sort of tribal allegiances, right? What we believe is less important than what is true. Right? And Athens decided the opposite when they killed Socrates. So this observation about the war between the gods is a sort of larger scale moment, but it's also a very specific point, right, about the flaws in Euthyphro's definition, right? Because if doing what is pious and holy is doing what is dear to the gods, then this war between the gods makes piety essentially impossible, right? If sacrifices to Poseidon please Poseidon but anger Zeus, is sacrificing to Poseidon pious, right? It's pious with respect to Poseidon, but it's impious with respect to Zeus, right? Because sacrificing to Poseidon is dear to Poseidon, but not to Zeus. So if there is this war between the gods, then Euthyphro's definition is meaningless, right? It is self-contradictory. I would also just mention here that this critique of religion can extend beyond the Greek pantheon, right? And we can see this problem in religiosity well beyond ancient Greece, right? This is what is also at the heart of religious conflicts in the medieval period and even into the modern period, right? Where what God loves is a motivation for faith, for piety, and then for war and religious enmity, right? We could sort of analogously say, how do I decide what the true God is? How do I know if what is dear to Allah is more holy than what is dear to Jesus? Right? In Islam, depictions of God are forbidden, while in Christianity they're celebrated. So, is it holy to depict God or not? Right? That we can think of the polytheism of the Greeks and this argument that Socrates is making about the difficulty of having gods with different values, to think about the different religions in the West, right? The distinctions between Islam and Judaism and Christianity, and for that matter, the distinctions between Western religions and non-Western religions, right? So, what is the holy? What is the actual nature of the holy? Different religions say different things, just as different gods say different things in ancient Greece. The point is, if the same thing can be said to be both loved and hated by a god, it is both holy and unholy, and therefore the holy will also be its opposite, making it a contradiction and an impossibility. Now, Euthyphro says, okay, you're right. The gods disagree. Then we have to revise my definition a little bit. We'll say, this is on page 8, that it's not what is dear to a god, but what is dear to all the gods. What is holy is what all the gods agree about. And Socrates says, all right, better, nice revision, good save. So what is it that all the gods agree about? And Euthyphro says, well, they all agree that anyone who kills someone unjustly must answer for it. And he says further, not only all the gods agree with this, but all men, all people agree with this also. If you kill someone unjustly, you should be punished for it. Socrates responds, well, yeah, that sounds right. Everyone agrees if you unjustly murder someone, you should be punished. But this doesn't actually escape the problem. It doesn't actually answer the question, right? Because what we mean by justly and unjustly is precisely what is at stake. And here he says, right, while we all agree that injustice should be punished, what we mean by injustice, we don't agree about. And he says, we see lawyers in court arguing all different kinds of ideas about what justice and injustice are. So to simply say all gods agree injustice should be punished doesn't actually get us any further. We have to have a definition of what we mean by just and unjust, what we mean by holy or unholy. And this is, I think, an important point, and something that is extremely relevant today. I think on both sides of our political divide, there are people saying, I can't believe the other side is letting this injustice go unpunished. How can they just live with this injustice? They are completely irresponsible. They're evil, right? They're letting these injustices stand. They don't believe in punishing injustice. And that's not at all what's happening, right? No one believes injustice shouldn't be punished. The breakdown is in what counts as just or unjust, right? It's a disagreement about what justice is. If we can't say, and I think this is the bigger point here, if we can't say what injustice is, we can't prosecute it. We can't hold anyone responsible for it. Unless we know what injustice is, then we can't hold anyone to account. So we have to have a definition of justice if law is ever going to work, right? If law is ever going to be enforceable, acceptable. If we have no common conception of what is wrong, right, then we can't ever agree on who should be punished. We need a way, Plato is seeing here, right? What Plato is sort of beginning to intimate is we need a way to demonstrate what justice is, to make it as clear as mathematical demonstrations, to attempt to make justice as clear as we can, with the standard being the clarity of mathematics. I think that this is also certainly what Plato's thinking about in the death of Socrates, right? That it is the failure to understand what justice is that allowed Athens to execute Socrates. So Socrates then, at the bottom of page 9, returns to Euthyphro's case. All right, very good. So the holy is what is dear to all the gods. So show me then that all the gods approve of prosecuting your father in these circumstances, that in this case what you're doing is holy. And Socrates and Euthyphro says, yes, right? I believe all the gods would agree with what I'm doing right now. But Socrates then goes on to pose a more difficult question. And it's really here that the heart of Socrates and Plato's point begins to come through. He asks, if all the gods love something, is that enough to make it holy? Okay, so we have refined Euthyphro's original idea, right? The holy is doing what is dear to the gods or dear to God. We've refined that definition to make it a little bit more acceptable, to make it more coherent anyway, to say the holy is doing what is dear to all the gods. But now, having reached this basic threshold of coherence, Socrates then asks what is more properly a philosophical question. Right? If all the gods love something, is that enough to make it holy? Should we believe something is holy just because someone values it, even if it is all of the gods who value it? The question is, does the fact that a god, or all the gods, does the fact that anyone loves something mean that that thing is good? So the way that Socrates asks this on page 10 is the holy loved by the gods because it is holy, or is it holy because it is loved by the gods? Euthyphro has said, what is holy is that which is loved by all the gods. Fine, but what does this mean? What is the relation between holiness and the love of the gods? Is something holy because the gods love it? Or do the gods love something because it's holy? In other words, it's a question of causation. What causes something to be holy? What causes the gods to love something? Right? Can what is good, what is holy, be decided, or is the good something that exists in itself, which is good by virtue of itself, not because it's loved by someone. Uh, so, what Socrates is getting at here is the idea of uh, the form of the holy again. But let me try and make this a little bit clearer, right? The example that Socrates goes on to give to try and clarify this is a series of relations between an active agent and a passive object, right? He says, we recognize a distinction between being carried and carrying, between leading and being led. There is someone that acts and someone who is acted upon. And the question Socrates is asking is, in the relationship between the gods and the holy, who is acting, what is acting, and who is being acted upon? And so, do the gods act upon the holy to make it holy? Or does the holy act upon the gods to make them love it? And this is an incredibly important difference, right? Because if it is the case that the gods act upon the holy, making it holy, then what is good by virtue of the fact that somebody loves it, that somebody desires it. It is dear to someone. It is good just because it is loved. If it's the other way around, if the holy acts upon the gods and makes them love it, then the good is not good because someone loves it. The good is good in itself, and it makes people love it. It is dear to people because of the thing that it is. Now, this is going to be Plato's position. This is Socrates' position. This is what Socrates hopes Euthyphro will recognize. And for a moment he does, but then he loses it, right? The idea that what is holy by virtue of itself, regardless of whether or not anyone loves it. The holy is holy. Regardless of whether or not anyone desires it, what is good because of what it is in itself. The good is independent. The holy is independent of our desires, of our will, of what we hold dear, what we love. Right? I can love what is not good, and by virtue of loving it, it doesn't become good. If I love what is good rather than what is not good, it is because I have learned what is good. I have learned those things that are good in themselves. I have learned to love what is deserving of love, what is appropriate to love. Right? So, what sort of the higher point, and going back to this larger critique of Greek religion that we get here, the higher point that Socrates is making here is that if the holy is holy in itself and acts upon the gods, causing them to love it, then the holy is itself more powerful than the gods. There is something above the gods that the gods are obliged, compelled to love and to hold dear. Right? The gods don't decide what's good. The good decides for the gods what they will love. So Socrates is positing this higher realm, a realm above the gods, a realm of forms, right? Because the form of the holy in itself, is what is good in itself and holy in itself, that which commands the love of the gods. Right? That which is able to command the gods, that which is able to demand something of the gods, must be above the gods. So there's this sort of higher realm. But this is, again, not entirely discrediting the gods, because the gods are those things that know what is holy in itself, that have knowledge of what is holy in itself, that love what is correct to love, because it commands love based on its own goodness. So, what causes something to be holy is the holy itself. Right? Now let's think about this a little bit, because it's an interesting philosophical problem. What causes something to be holy is the form of holiness itself. That form is like a self-caused being. Nothing causes anything to be holy but the form of holiness itself. The forms, in general, are self-caused. They are then in turn the cause of everything, every example of, in this case, the holy. Maybe I shouldn't dwell on this too much, but I just want to sort of flag this question of causation with relation to the nature of the good. What causes something to be good? And for Plato, the good is self-caused. Good is good by virtue of itself. It is good independently of our desires. It is objectively good, we would say. Right? Good is objective. No one gets to decide, not even the gods, what is good. So Euthyphro feels as though Socrates is spinning his words at this point. He's getting confused. He's lost. He's annoyed. Right? Socrates is doing his thing, annoying people. Right? Euthyphro is starting to get annoyed, and he wants these arguments to stand still. I thought we had it. Right? We said holy is what all the gods love. Isn't that enough? Why are you making this more complicated than it needs to be? Right? We got a definition. Let's just go with it. Right? And Socrates says, I would like nothing more than for arguments to stand still, to be fixed and immovable. And this is the goal of Socrates' questioning, his seeking. This is the goal of Socratic philosophy and Platonic philosophy, to find those arguments that are stable, to find a stable and immovable truth. And that is what the forms are supposed to be. And so, Euthyphro is getting annoyed. Socrates says, all right, let's try and clarify this. He asks, what is the relation then between the holy and justice. Is the holy part of justice, or is justice part of the holy? Now, this is an interesting move for Socrates to make here. Uh, we have just come from deciding, deciding that the holy is over and above the gods, that the holy is holy in itself and compels the gods to love it. And now Socrates is seeking something even higher above the holy. The holy is, again, just a stepping stone to some higher form. We want a definition of the holy, now that the holy stands independent of God's love, or recognizing that it isn't caused by God's love. We're seeking for the cause of holiness. What a definition of the holy would be that doesn't rely on this idea of God's love, right? Because God's love, the love of the gods, can't be the cause of the holy, because the holy is the cause of God's love. So, what is above the holy, or what might be a cause of the holy? Plato has Socrates just bring this up briefly, right? To ask, well, what's the relation between the holy and the just? Is the holy part of justice, or is justice part of the holy? And this is where Euthyphro becomes confused. What are you talking about? Is the holy part of justice? Are justice and the holy the same? Right? And I think in asking this question, even just in raising this question, Socrates is once again calling into question the nature of Greek religion, and maybe at this point of religiosity itself, right? Because it would seem, not just from Euthyphro's answers, but from what Socrates believes, that the holy is part of justice and not the other way around. That justice is a bigger concept than the holy. And if that's true, then the holy is a kind of subsection of justice. The holy is caused by justice and is subordinate to justice. So that, and this sort of fits with the argument that Socrates is making about the gods, right? That if the gods aren't above the holy commands the gods, then there has to be something above the gods, above the holy, that causes the holy to be what it is. And this is justice. So, is everything that is just also holy? Right? That's what it means to ask if justice is only part of the holy. Or is everything that is holy also just? Right? And Euthyphro will say, once this is explained to him a little bit more clearly, that the holy is part of justice, that justice is a bigger concept. And holiness is the part of justice that is about, as Euthyphro says, ministering to the gods. Right? Justice means ministering to gods and people, and the holy is that part of justice that is about ministering to the gods. So this seems like a pretty good answer, right? justice is divided into uh, justice for the gods and justice for people. But Socrates, again, is going to ask a question of definition, right, to bring up another caveat or qualification here. What do you mean by ministering? Ministering is a kind of taking care, right? I minister to people means I take care of them. The term in Greek is also a kind of caretaking, right? In the sense that someone who ministers to horses would be a horse trainer. Someone who ministers to dogs would be a dog trainer. Someone who takes care of, but also kind of shepherds and trains and guides. And so if the part of justice that is holiness is ministering to the gods, holiness now means ministering or correctly ministering to the gods, then it means that piety is taking care of or helping the gods. Now, this in itself is problematic, right? How can it be that piety means taking care of the gods, helping the gods? Why is this a problem? Because to minister to also means, in some sense, to improve upon, right? To train, to take care of, is to improve. The idea that humans could in any way improve the gods doesn't make any sense, right? Gods are better than human beings. Gods are more complete, more knowledgeable, more powerful. How could it be that humans could ever improve the gods? Socrates points this out. Euthyphro says, yeah, okay, you're right. That doesn't make any sense. I guess what I mean by ministering is that humans serve the gods. Right? Human beings are in service to the gods. But this, Socrates thinks, is a problematic answer also. Right? All service aims at some product, Socrates thinks, right? I serve the shipbuilder in order to make a ship. I serve the farmer in order to yield a crop. I serve the general in order to win a war. So what is it that we are in service to the gods for? What is our service aiming to produce? Why are we in the service of the gods? Euthyphro is very fed up with Socrates' questioning right now. Piety is service to the gods. What does it mean to serve the gods? How do we serve the gods? It's still the original question. Okay, you've said piety is now service to the gods. Well, how do we serve the gods? If I want to be pious, I need to know what this service is about. To what end am I serving the gods? How do I serve the gods? What are we all trying to produce here? Right? Euthyphro says, it is difficult to learn accurately how things stand in these matters. Speaking freely, however, I can tell you that if a man knows how to say and do things acceptable to the gods in prayer and sacrifice, those things are holy, and they preserve both families and cities and keep them safe. Right? So, look, Socrates, this is really complicated. It's obviously too complicated for you to understand. All I can tell you, if you know how to do things that are acceptable to the gods, then the gods will keep your family and your city safe. Right? So what the service of the gods produces is safety. Safety of my family, safety of my city. But Euthyphro, though he has identified what the product of this service might be, has gone back to his original definition of piety when he's saying what this service consists of. Right? Man who knows how to say and do things acceptable to the gods in prayer and sacrifice. And so you get safety if you know how to pray and sacrifice in a way that's acceptable to the gods. So you serve the gods through prayer and sacrifice, and it produces safety. So the holy, Socrates says, is knowledge of how to pray and sacrifice. To Socrates, this sounds strange. Right? On page 18, he asks, so the art of holiness would be a kind of business transaction between gods and men, right? To know how to ask for things from the gods in prayer and how to give things to the gods in sacrifice. Right? It is an exchange of goods and services. Right? Piety is like knowing how to make a business deal. Right? But it sounds very different from the common idea of piety. Right? It sounds sort of the way we imagine pagan religion, right? I make a sacrifice and God gives me something. Right? I give God a bushel of my wheat and he provides me with a good crop for next year. It is a business exchange. So Socrates is pointing out this sort of odd feature of polytheistic religion, of Athenian religion. A interpretation that Euthyphro himself has essentially offered up. But here's the next question, right? Why do the gods want our sacrifices? If they're so much more powerful than us, so much more knowledgeable than us, can we actually give them anything that they need or want? Why would a god want praise from us? Why would a god want anything from us? What do they get from it? Why is it holy to give things to the god and to the gods? Euthyphro says, well, they get praise and honor. So, once again, we are back to the original definition. Right? The holy is what is acceptable to the gods. We give them praise and honor, those things that are dear to them. And maybe in return, we get something back. So we've gone in a large circle, right? And Socrates points this out, right? We had gone from saying that the holy is doing what is dear to the gods to saying that the holy is that which is independent of the gods and which the gods love not because it's dear to them, but because it is holy in itself. But now we are back to saying that the holy is what is dear to the gods. Euthyphro has failed to take up the truly philosophical content of this debate. He fell off in the argument. He wasn't able to follow the argument. And the moment that he falls off is that moment where Socrates is attempting to push him beyond a concept of just the holy, right? We reach a moment of escape from Euthyphro's worldview, from Euthyphro's idea of the holy, when we reach that high point in the discussion where Euthyphro and Socrates agree that the holy is independent and holy in itself, and it obliges the gods to love it. We were so close to breaking into genuinely philosophical material. Socrates was so close to drawing Euthyphro into an answer to his question about the definition of the holy in itself, coherent, clear definition, right? So close when they were considering the relation between the holy and justice, right? But it was in that moment, right, where Euthyphro gets confused about the nature of justice and its relation to the holy, where he falls back into this idea of ministering to the gods. Right? He returns to this idea of serving the gods, doing what pleases the gods. Euthyphro isn't able to keep these philosophical arguments in his mind. So already, or not already, but by the end, what we see is this expert in religiosity can't explain what the holy is. He goes around in circles. He's unable to answer these questions. And Socrates is unable to get him to give a true definition of justice. He says, if you can't show me the holy and teach me to defend myself from Meletus, then I'm as good as dead. Right? Our own religious leaders, our own experts in religion, can't tell me the difference between the holy and the holy. They can't tell me the true nature of the pious. And the way that Socrates expresses this is, now I will never be able to prove to Meletus, the person accusing me of crimes, that what I did wasn't actually impious. Right? But I think what Plato wants to show us is that Euthyphro doesn't know what the pious is. Neither does Meletus. Meletus doesn't know what's pious and impious. He's accusing Socrates of impiety without knowing what piety is. He's accusing Socrates of a crime, but he doesn't know what justice is. So that Meletus, just like Euthyphro, is operating with a false idea of the pious and impious. They are both these young, ambitious people that want others to believe they know what the pious is because they see a career opportunity, because they see an opportunity for glory and praise. And there are several interesting moments sort of in the middle, beginning to middle of the text, where Socrates is talking about why everyone believes these false ideas. He says, it's because people present themselves with authority. Right? Here Meletus is saying, I know what the pious is. I know it better than my father. I know it better than Socrates. They present themselves as authoritative, as experts. But when they're actually pressed through philosophical questioning, they can't give an answer. And that is infuriating to them. Right? By the end, Euthyphro says, gets fed up. Right? He's done with this questioning. And Socrates says, come, please, answer one more question. I have to know what the impious and pious are if I'm going to make it through my trial. And Euthyphro essentially says, no, Socrates, I'm out of time. I can't teach you anymore today. You're a bad student. You don't get it, right? I'm sick of this, and I'm going to go. And so we see the failure of the Athenian people, the failure of the many, the failure of these experts to actually think about what's at stake, the failure of the people to rise to the level of philosophical thinking. And we also get an argument for why knowledge is an essential part of ethics and of justice. Right? If I don't know what justice is, then I have no justification for prosecution. And this relationship between knowledge and justice, as well as the uh, the dynamic between the philosopher who is able to grapple with these questions and the many who are unwilling or unable to grapple with these questions. Uh, these are two relationships, two questions that we pick up and look at in more detail in Book 7 of the Republic for next week, where we'll also think in more detail about what it means for something to be good in itself, what it means for the forms to be independent of the physical world, for something like the good, the pious, the just to be independent and good and just in themselves. All right, so that will do it for today, and I will see you all in our live meeting at 3:40. All right, until next time, adios.